Welcome to week one of Race and Gender and Religion and Culture, Reproducing Society. This week, we're going to be talking about race. What is it? What does it do? And I wanted to begin by inviting you all to share a little bit about your own, or reflect a little bit on your own definition of race. When you think about race, what's the first definition that comes to mind? How would you describe it? So just take a second, jot down the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay, so I want you to kind of hold on to this idea of race that you have as kind of your common sense idea of race coming into this class, and hold on to that while we move through the rest of this presentation. So I think it's a good idea to start by thinking about, what is the idea of race? What is it actually, what is its history? How does it come to us? Um, and even though this class is kind of focused on moving from thinking about, you know, race in terms of identity or race in terms of like who one is, and more thinking about race in terms of what it does in society, um, I think it does help us to have an understanding of what race is in order to kind of recognize what are some of the assumptions about race that are the common sense in our society, and how are they different from the actual kind of history of race and the actual effect of race socially. So on the Canvas, there's a link to this discussion between Dorothy Roberts and Jonathan Marks and this interviewer, and if you'll watch from about the 50-second mark to the 5-minute mark and then return to this video, we'll continue our discussion. So go ahead and pause this and then do that and come back. Great, so hopefully you've watched that video, and I just wanted to give a little bit of a kind of rundown of these 3 different definitions of race that Roberts and Marx clue us into, and how that will kind of help us think about race and what race does in this class. So they both talk about how there is a biological idea of race, right? That there, this biological idea of race regards a subdivision within a species that's so kind of genetically distinct as to be its own race within the species. And I think it's important to really emphasize and hear them emphasizing, right? Human beings don't actually fall into this biological definition of race in terms of the differences that exist between human beings, right? There's as much genetic similarity between me and a white person as there is between me and a black person. So the kind of common sense assumption, right, that there's some kind of natural, genetic, or biological distinctiveness to, um, or justification for the ideas of race or racial groupings that we have in our society just doesn't hold up biologically speaking. But then there's these 2 other ideas of race that they get at, right? Political or social kind of division or grouping of humans. And this is often used to um, arrange human beings into hierarchical groupings. So there's this kind of political and social division. And then there's this idea of race that Marx talks about being from the kind of 18th century of race as a kind of collective identity of a people, right? So he refers to like Jews or the Irish might be thought of as a race under this kind of category. And indeed, if you kind of look even into the early 20th century in a lot of the kind of popular literature of the time, right? People are referring to Jews and Gentiles or the Irish as different races, right? So they hadn't become white, or the common sense around their kind of collective identity was not understood as white in the way that we understand that today. So it's interesting to think about, right, the fact that there's these kind of historical, um, political, or social, or kind of collective identities or divisions that have come to take on a kind of natural character to them, or we think of them as having to do with nature. And so I think the reading for this week will kind of help us understand more of why that is, and where that comes from, and how that remains with us today. But in keeping with these kind of challenging the misconception of there being some kind of natural or biological basis to race, in this class we're going to be understanding race primarily in terms of the political and social groupings of human beings. So we will talk a bit about, the ways that race as this kind of idea of collective identity is at play socially, but that's not going to be the main focus here. We're primarily going to think about how does race work? What does race do as a kind of tool for politically and socially grouping human beings? So, in that regard, we're going to think about race not as a kind of natural, biological kind of division of human beings, but as something that's the product of certain political and social um, means of distinguishing people from each other. So in this instance, right, we can think about how race is a product of racism, and I think this will become clear more in the readings as well. But thinking about, what are the laws, what are the kind of means of social enforcement, what are the justifications that are given in the 16th and 17th centuries for dividing human beings into these um, racial categories, right? And so we can see that there is a kind of discrimination, right, that precedes these groupings. And so it's important to think about race as a product of racism. Then we're going to look at how it's related to political and religious status, and that really comes out in the readings for this week as well. We're going to think about race as a heredity and inheritance system. So this is really important for understanding why race kind of has the illusion of being biological or being based in nature in some way, because the way that the laws around race were set up, especially in the kind of early periods in the US, were all about managing kinship and managing sex and managing reproduction, right? And so one way to give the illusion of the natural to a way of distinguishing people from each other is to kind of manage, right, who's able to reproduce with whom, and in order to kind of like ensure the social division you set up. And you can think of this in terms of race, but it also is helpful to think about this in terms of something like class, right? The ways that kind of class stratifications are often reproduced along class lines, because rich people often marry rich people. And so once social worlds um, have a lot to do with the reproduction of social divisions. So that's something that'll be interesting to think about more in this class. And then finally, thinking about race as a way of marking individuals and groups in order to arrange them hierarchically, right? So I think a kind of obvious example of this is skin color in um, particularly in um, the U.S., but not just the U.S., because you know, race and colonialism were kind of global project. But skin color kind of emerges as a primary marker of what group one belongs to, and that is kind of used to try to arrange people hierarchically or to maybe determine one's kind of uh, social position or how one relates to others socially. And so it'll be interesting to kind of get into the readings for this week and delve into some more concrete examples of how we can see race as this political and social grouping of humans, but the ways that the religious and the reproductive and the kind of political or um, class based divisions all converge to kind of consolidate this idea of race. So, in thinking about race and how it relates to the reproduction of society, we have to think about how race itself gets reproduced. So, how does it determine the value of people or group politically and socially? How are the associations that get made between different races reproduced? So we might think about things like stereotypes or different images of racial groups and how those associations continue to be repeated. And then we might think too, like, how did these associations get changed? So, you know, now there's a kind of common sense in which, um, black celebrities have a large visibility in certain areas, from sports to movies, for instance. And so that has come with different associations um, with blackness. But there's still a racial association, right? So it's interesting to think both about how those associations get changed and also how they still depend on reproducing a fundamental idea of race. So I think I'm going to stop here, but just leave you with this thought, right? If we think about race and gender as tools, um, that helps us start to ask, what are race and gender useful for? And think about how they're actually used in society, not just how people kind of understand them as a natural kind of identity that belongs to people inherently or belongs to groups inherently. So it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts both on this lecture and on the readings in general.